The rise of Dhul Qarnayn. Long ago, in the pages of history, there lived a man whose name would echo through centuries, a man known as Dhul Qarnayn. The Qur'an speaks of him in Surah Al-Kahf, describing him as a righteous ruler to whom Allah had granted both power and guidance. He was not an ordinary king, for his authority was not merely over land and people, but it was grounded in faith and justice and in the divine mission he carried upon his shoulders. His heart was filled with gratitude towards Allah, and his actions reflected wisdom and mercy toward all who lived under his rule. Dhul Qarnayn was a leader whose power extended far and wide, yet he never allowed pride to corrupt his heart. He understood that kingship was not a privilege for personal gain, but a trust given by the Creator to be used in the service of truth and justice. People came to know him not only for his might, but for his fairness and his ability to bring peace among those in conflict. Unlike rulers who crushed opposition with cruelty, he listened to disputes with patience, judged fairly, and ensured that the weak were not oppressed. Titled Dhul Qarnayn, meaning the one with two horns, has been explained in various ways. Some scholars say it refers to his ability to travel to the two farthest ends of the earth, reaching both east and west. Others say it was a symbol of his strength and his ability to conquer with justice and righteousness. Regardless of the meaning, his name became a symbol of a leader whose reach spanned great distances and whose influence touched many nations. Quran describes how Allah gave Dhul Qarnayn the means to achieve whatever he intended. This did not mean unlimited wealth or blind power, but rather the resources, knowledge, and opportunities necessary to fulfill his mission. He could travel far and accomplish great things, yet always within the bounds of justice and with the guidance of his Lord. His reign was unlike that of tyrants, for he never sought to enslave or exploit, but to bring stability to lands torn by disorder. One of the remarkable qualities of Dhul Qarnayn was his determination to leave no region untouched by the light of justice. He set out on journeys that would take him to the very edges of the known world, not for conquest alone, but to observe the conditions of people and to guide them toward the worship of Allah. His first great journey took him toward the west, where the sun sets. This was not a casual expedition, but a long and arduous mission that took him through deserts, mountains, and lands unknown to his people. He and his companions traveled for many days, facing challenges along the way. They crossed vast stretches of land where food and water were scarce, yet Dhul Qarnayn's leadership inspired them to continue, for they knew that their journey had a higher purpose. They were not merely explorers, but bearers of justice, sent to bring order to places where chaos reigned. When Dhul Qarnayn finally reached the farthest western point, he came to a place described in the Quran as where the sun appeared to set in a dark, murky spring. Of course, the sun itself does not set upon the earth, but from the perspective of the travelers, it seemed to sink into the horizon over a body of water, darkened by its depth and surroundings. Here he encountered a people whose ways and conditions were unlike any he had seen before. Some among them were righteous, while others were corrupt and unjust. Allah inspired Dhul Qarnayn to judge between them, giving him the choice to punish the wrongdoers or to treat them with kindness and guide them. Dhul Qarnayn chose a path that showed both firmness and mercy. He declared that those who continued in wrongdoing would face justice, while those who believed and acted righteously would be rewarded. His words carried weight, for they were not empty promises but the decrees of a ruler who acted with divine guidance. This encounter became an example of how a leader can balance strength with compassion, ensuring that justice is not mixed with cruelty. After establishing peace in the western lands, Dhul Qarnayn prepared for another journey. This time his path lay toward the east, where the sun rises. He had heard of distant lands beyond deserts and mountains, where people lived in ways unfamiliar to his own culture. His goal was not to conquer, but to understand, to observe, and to bring the message of truth to those who had not heard it. His journey to the east would be long and filled with trials, but Dhul Qarnayn was a man whose will could not be broken by hardship. His army and followers trusted him completely. They knew that he never acted for personal glory, but for the sake of fulfilling the trust placed upon him by Allah. His presence inspired loyalty and courage. He treated his soldiers and companions with fairness, sharing in their hardships and never demanding comforts for himself while others suffered. Along the way he would speak to them, reminding them of their higher purpose and the reward that awaited those who stood firm in the service of Allah. The journey toward the east began through valleys and rivers until they reached lands where the heat of the sun was fierce and relentless. The people of these lands had little protection from the sun, for they built no roofs or shelters. Instead, they lived according to the rhythm of the day, rising early to work and retreating to the shade of natural formations when the heat became unbearable. They had not yet been touched by advanced civilizations, and their way of life was simple. Dhul Qarnayn did not mock their simplicity, nor seek to change their customs unless they were unjust. Rather, he observed them with wisdom. Seeking to understand before acting, he saw in them a natural innocence, for they had not been corrupted by greed or oppression. They lived close to the earth and depended on its gifts for survival. Yet even in such remote places, Dhul Qarnayn knew the importance of guiding people toward the truth and helping them avoid the traps of injustice. It was during these early journeys that Dhul Qarnayn's reputation began to grow beyond his own people. Stories of a just ruler who traveled the ends of the earth to protect the weak and punish the wicked spread across lands both near and far. Traders and travelers carried these stories into new regions where people began to hope that one day he might visit their land and bring peace to their troubles. But Dhul Qarnayn's mission was far from over, for beyond the lands he had seen lay a region plagued by a force of corruption and destruction, the likes of which few had encountered. These were the tribes of Yajuj and Majuj, who would bring terror to all who lived near them. His meeting with the people oppressed by these forces would mark the next and perhaps most significant chapter of his journey. But before he reached them, he would have to travel through lands even more remote and difficult than any he had faced before. His heart remained steadfast, for he knew that Allah was with him, guiding his steps toward a purpose greater than any king could imagine. The journey to the east and the first signs of Yajuj and Majuj. After bringing peace and justice to the lands of the west, Dhul Qarnayn turned his attention toward the east. The journey ahead was long and uncertain, yet he did not hesitate, for he was a man chosen for great trials and trusted with a mission that spanned the corners of the earth. His heart was firm in the remembrance of Allah, and his will was strong against the hardships that awaited him. With his companions and army ready to follow, he set out once more, determined to fulfill the purpose for which he had been blessed with knowledge and authority. The path toward the east was unlike anything they had experienced before. It began with fertile valleys and green lands, but soon shifted into barren plains where the wind blew hot and the ground cracked under the sun's relentless heat. For days, they marched under skies without clouds and nights that offered little relief from the burning air. Yet Dhul Qarnayn neither complained nor slowed his pace. His presence was a constant source of strength to his men, for he shared their hardships and encouraged them with words that reminded them their mission was not for worldly gain but for the service of truth and justice. As they traveled further east, the landscape began to change. Mountains rose in the distance, their peaks jagged like the teeth of a great beast. The slopes were steep and rocky, making the path treacherous for both men and animals. Still, Dhul Qarnayn led them on with steady determination. He paused often to assist those who struggled, reminding them that patience in difficulty brought reward from Allah. By his example, he taught that a true leader did not rule from comfort, but walked alongside his people through every trial. After many days of travel, they reached a region where the sun's heat was more intense than any they had felt before. Here the Qur'an describes how the people had little protection from the rising sun. Unlike the lands of the west, these people had no elaborate buildings or high walls. Their homes were simple shelters made from whatever material they could gather from the earth and trees. They rose early to begin their work before the sun reached its highest point and spent the hottest hours in the shade of natural rock formations or in the shelter of caves. The people of this land were unlike those Dhul Qarnayn had met before. They were not warlike, nor did they live in cities with armies and fortifications. Their lives were humble and closely tied to the rhythm of nature. They hunted and gathered from the land, taking only what they needed and offering hospitality to strangers who passed through. Their language was unfamiliar to Dhul Qarnayn's people, but through signs and interpreters he was able to speak with them. Dhul Qarnayn saw that these people lived in peace and did not harm one another. He did not interfere with their way of life, for there was no injustice to correct. Instead, he used the opportunity to remind his followers that the diversity of nations and peoples was part of Allah's design, and that righteousness was not limited to wealth or power, but could be found in the hearts of the humble. Leaving the eastern lands in peace, Dhul Qarnayn continued his journey. He knew that his mission was not yet complete, for he had heard of distant places where oppression and chaos ruled. He traveled through mountain passes where the air grew thin and the winds howled through the cliffs. His men grew weary, but his resolve only deepened, for the path ahead was leading him toward the great challenge for which he had been prepared. It was in these northern highlands that Dhul Qarnayn reached a people unlike any he had seen before. The Qur'an describes them as a nation who could hardly understand speech. Their language was so distant from his own that even his most skilled interpreters struggled to translate. Yet despite this barrier, they found ways to communicate through gestures and symbols. They told him of their plight, a constant threat from two powerful tribes, known as Yajuj and Majuj. People described Yajuj and Majuj as relentless and destructive tribes who emerged from behind the mountains to raid their lands. These invaders spared no one and destroyed everything in their path, burning crops, stealing food, and taking lives without mercy. The nation lived in constant fear, never knowing when the next attack would come. They pleaded with Dhul Qarnayn for help, offering to pay him tribute if he would build a barrier to protect them from the terror of Yajuj. Majuj. Dhul Qarnayn listened with great care. He saw in their eyes the deep suffering they had endured and the desperation in their voices. Yet his answer was not driven by greed for wealth. He told them that the strength and resources Allah had granted him were enough, and that he would not take their payment. Instead, he asked for their cooperation and labor to help in the task together. He reminded them that ultimate protection came only from Allah, and that any barrier they built would stand by His will alone. The decision to help these people marked a turning point in Dhul Qarnayn's journey. This was not a simple matter of resolving disputes or advising communities. This was a challenge against a force of corruption and violence that had long plagued the region. To succeed, he would need the strength of his men, the cooperation of the locals, and the guidance of Allah. Above all, he would need to build something that could withstand the relentless attempts of Yajuj and Majuj to break through. In the days that followed, Dhul Qarnayn studied the land carefully. The mountains on either side formed a narrow pass through which Yajuj and Majuj would enter. This was the perfect place to construct a barrier that would block their path entirely. The work ahead would be immense, requiring iron large enough to fill the gap and molten copper to bind it together. Yet Dhul Qarnayn's experience as a ruler and builder made him confident that it could be done with unity and determination. People marveled at his leadership, for he worked alongside them, lifting stones and shaping iron with his own hands. He inspired them not only with his strength, but with his humility. For Dhul Qarnayn, this was not the work of a distant king issuing orders from a throne, but the duty of a servant of Allah, ensuring that justice prevailed on the earth. Each day the barrier grew higher and stronger, the sound of hammers and the heat of furnaces filling the air, as the mountain pass slowly disappeared behind walls of solid iron. Yet, as the barrier neared completion, Dhul Qarnayn knew that this was not the end of the story, for one day, as the Qur'an foretells, the time will come when the barrier will fall, and Yajuj and Majuj will be released once again to spread corruption. But until that day, the people would live in peace and safety, able to work their lands and raise their children without fear. That peace was now within their reach, and it would be his honor to give it to them with the help of Allah, the Great Barrier, and the truth of Yajuj and Majuj. Narrow mountain pass echoed with the sound of constant work as Dhul Qarnayn, and the people labored day after day to raise the Great Barrier. The location was chosen with care, for the mountains on either side formed natural walls, and the gap between them was the only route Yajuj and Majuj used to descend upon the helpless villages. It was here that Dhul Qarnayn would make his stand against the corruption that had spread for generations. His plan was not simply to create a wall of stone, but a structure that would endure the storms of time and the endless assaults of these fierce tribes. He ordered the gathering of iron in vast quantities. The people brought every piece they could find from tools, weapons, and deposits found in the hills. The iron was stacked into layers, filling the gap from one side of the mountains to the other. As the layers rose higher, Dhul Qarnayn commanded that they be heated until they glowed red from the flames of massive furnaces. The heat shimmered in the air, and the smell of burning fuel filled the pass. When the iron was glowing hot, he instructed molten copper to be poured over it, seeping into every crack and binding the layers into a single unbreakable mass. The work was exhausting, yet Dhul Qarnayn never stood aside to watch others toil. He lifted heavy loads alongside the men, struck iron with his hammer, and carried buckets of molten copper with careful strength. His example inspired the people to work harder, for they saw that their leader valued their effort and shared their burden. The barrier rose higher and higher until it towered above their heads, its smooth surface glinting in the sun like a wall of burnished bronze. When at last the final layer was set in place, Dhul Qarnayn stepped back to look upon the work. The pass was sealed completely. The once open path that had allowed Yajuj and Majuj to raid the valleys now stood closed behind a fortress of metal. No tool could break it, and no fire could melt it. The people stared in awe, for they had never seen such a construction before. Their fear began to fade, replaced by relief and gratitude. Dhul Qarnayn, however, did not allow them to place their trust in the barrier alone. He gathered them together and spoke with a voice that carried through the pass. "This barrier is a mercy from my Lord. It will protect you for as long as He wills. But when the promise of my Lord comes to pass, He will bring it down, and Yajuj and Majuj will be released to spread corruption once more. Therefore place your trust not in this wall, but in Allah, who is the true protector." The people listened carefully, for they could see the truth in his words. A wall could stand for centuries, but no creation of man could last forever. They asked him about Yajuj and Majuj, and Dhul Qarnayn told them what he had learned. These tribes were not ordinary enemies. They were vast in number, fierce in nature, and driven by a hunger for destruction that could not be satisfied. They swarmed like locusts, consuming everything in their path. When the barrier was open, they would come in waves, overwhelming every defense and leaving desolation in their wake. He warned them that the time of their release would come near the end of the world. It would be a sign among the many signs of the last day. When that time arrived, no force on earth could stop them, and they would spread across the land as the Qur'an describes, surging down from every height. But until then, they were contained, and the people had been granted a period of safety to live and worship Allah in peace with. The threat of Yajuj and Majuj contained the valleys began to flourish once more. The people returned to their farms and pastures without fear. Their children could play under the open sky without the shadow of danger hanging over them. Trade routes reopened, bringing goods from distant lands, and the sound of life replaced the silence of fear. Dhul Qarnayn stayed with them for a time, ensuring that they were safe and that justice was upheld among them. He taught them to remain vigilant in their faith, for he knew that the greatest defense against all evil was the remembrance of Allah. As the seasons passed, Dhul Qarnayn prepared to continue his journey, for his mission was not yet complete. He had traveled to the farthest west and the farthest east, and now he had stood at the northern edge of the known world. His travels had brought him into contact with people of many tongues and customs, yet his purpose had remained the same: to guide them to truth, to protect the oppressed, and to uphold the command of his Lord. Wherever he went, he left behind not just walls and judgments, but lessons that would live on long after he departed. Before leaving the land, Dhul Qarnayn walked one last time along the length of the barrier. The iron and copper shone in the light of the morning sun. The surface was smooth and unbroken, and the mountains on either side stood like eternal guardians. He placed his hand upon the wall and silently thanked Allah for granting him the means to protect these people. Then he turned away, knowing that his journey was leading him toward the final chapter of his mission. A chapter that would carry with it warnings for all of humanity. The story of Yajuj and Majuj would spread far beyond these mountains. Travelers, merchants, and scholars would carry the tale to every corner of the world. Some would believe it and take heed, while others would dismiss it as myth. Yet the truth would remain written in the Qur'an and preserved for those who sought guidance. For Dhul Qarnayn knew that his deeds were not for his own glory, but for the sake of Allah and for the generations who would one day face the trials foretold in the final days. The final advice and the prophecy of Yajuj and Majuj, the Great Barrier, was completed, and the people were safe from the relentless raids of Yajuj and Majuj. Dhul Qarnayn knew his mission in that land was fulfilled. Yet he also knew that his duty as a servant of Allah did not end with the raising of iron and copper walls. His purpose was greater than a single act of protection. It was to guide people to the truth and prepare them for the trials that would one day come. He called the leaders of the nation together and stood before them with the authority of a ruler and the humility of a believer. He began by reminding them that all power belongs to Allah and that nothing in the heavens or the earth can resist his will. The barrier he had built was strong, but it was not eternal. It would stand only for as long as Allah decreed, and when the appointed time came, it would fall. He warned them not to place their trust in the wall, but in the One who created them and sustained them. He told them that the danger of Yajuj and Majuj was not gone forever, but merely delayed until the last age of the world, when the promise of Allah would come to pass. The people listened in silence as Dhul Qarnayn described what would happen in that time. He spoke of a day when the barrier would be destroyed not by human hands, but by the command of Allah. Yajuj and Majuj would pour forth in countless numbers, surging over mountains and valleys, leaving destruction wherever they passed. No army would be able to defeat them, and no fortress would be strong enough to withstand their assault. They would consume the resources of the earth and leave nothing in their path untouched. Their spread would be so great that they would reach every corner of the inhabited world. Dhul Qarnayn explained that their release would be one of the major signs of the Day of Judgment. When that day came, humanity would face trials unlike any before. He urged the people to hold fast to their faith, to obey the commands of Allah, and to avoid the corruption and injustice that could lead to their own downfall. He reminded them that the greatest protection was not a wall of metal, but the wall of righteousness built in the hearts of the believers, for no force of evil could overcome a soul steadfast in the remembrance of its Lord. He also told them that the story of Yecuc was not only about destruction, but also about the mercy of Allah, for in delaying their release, Allah had given humanity time to repent, to turn away from injustice, and to live according to His guidance. Every day that the barrier stood was a gift and an opportunity to do good. Before the final hour arrived, Dhul Qarnayn urged them not to waste that time in heedlessness, but to prepare for the life to come, which was everlasting compared to the fleeting years of this world. After giving this advice, Dhul Qarnayn prepared to leave the land. The people came to him with gifts in gratitude for what he had done, but he refused them, saying that his reward was with Allah alone. They tried to persuade him to stay as their king, yet he declined, for his journey was not finished, and there were still lands beyond the horizon where injustice cried out for a hand of justice and guidance. He left them with leaders he had taught to govern wisely and with laws rooted in fairness and truth. As he and his companions departed the mountain pass, the great barrier stood gleaming in the sunlight. A silent guardian watching over the valleys beyond it, Yajuj and Majuj, remained trapped, unable to break through its unyielding surface. Their strength and numbers were great, but the decree of Allah was greater, and until the appointed time they could not move against the world. The journey that followed took Dhul Qarnayn to other distant regions where he continued to fulfill his mission. He met people of many tongues and customs, some who welcomed his wisdom and others who resisted his calls to justice, yet in every place he upheld the same principles: fairness, mercy, and unwavering devotion to Allah. His name became known in lands far from where he had ruled, and his legacy grew not because of the empires he built, but because of the justice he spread. The story of Dhul Qarnayn and the barrier became one of the enduring lessons of history, preserved in the Qur'an and remembered by generations. It stood as a reminder that power is a trust, not a possession, that protection is from Allah alone, and that even the mightiest works of human hands are subject to His will. It also stood as a warning that the trials of the end times are certain, and that only those who prepare their souls with faith and good deeds will find safety when the world is shaken. In the end, Dhul Qarnayn was not remembered merely as a conqueror, but as a servant of Allah who used his strength to protect the weak, guide the lost, and uphold the truth. His journeys to the west, the east, and the far north were not for personal glory, but for fulfilling the command of his Lord. The wall he built may one day fall, but the lessons he left behind remain unbroken, teaching humanity that the path of justice and faith is the only path that leads to eternal success. And so his journey continued into the pages of history, his deeds carried in the hearts of those who believed, and his name spoken with respect by those who understood the weight of his mission. The great barrier still stands somewhere in the lands Allah has hidden from our sight, waiting for the day when the command will come, and Yajuj and Majuj will be unleashed as a final sign for the world. This is the truth Allah has revealed, and it will come to pass as surely as the sun rises in the east and sets in the west. The end.